Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. My graduate advisor, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens, who was the guest on episode 60, is back today to talk about one of the most, I think, interesting, confounding, and promising areas of inquiry I can imagine. And that is the stubbornly resistant to rational investigation phenomenon of the UFO, and by extension, all kinds of weird shit around UFO, including things like Mothman, DMT, insectoid entities, the curious case of Skinwalker Ranch and its bizarre panoply of paranormal phenomena. As Sean puts it, if there is ever a place where multiple perspectives run amok, bumping into each other and in general creating chaos, it is around aliens and the craft they pilot. I mean, we know that may not even be the appropriate way of talking about these things, that there is something about these phenomena that refuse to reside neatly into the oversimple categories of subjective or objective knowledge. And so for a show committed to exploring where we are in the midst of a series of cascading paradigm shifts, it seems only right that the conversation's orbit would return again and again to the dragons at the edges of our maps. And of course, anyone who's been listening to this show has heard me tell a few stories about my own puzzling, potentially alien encounters. In fact, the first podcast I ever participated in was Eric Davis's Expanding Mind way back in 2011. And we spent most of that hour talking about those experiences and where they fit or don't fit into our clearly insufficient categories. So it's with delight that I bring Sean back on the show today to talk about the new course he'll be leading in the fall on Exostudies as a fabulous touch point for some deep, challenging philosophical inquiries into the nature of knowledge and the mind. But before we start, I want to thank every one of you who has been supporting this show on Patreon and the 6 new people: Damian Everett, Jamie Gaviola, Henry Anderson, Sean Thompson, Jeff Gould, and Will Franke, who have joined on as Patreon supporters this week, bringing me that much closer to my goal of 200 supporters. Not just an arbitrary number, but the number at which point this show will be paying my rent. If you're interested in partaking in the Future Fossils Book Club, that's one of many things that I do for supporters of this show. And we just had an excellent conversation about Diana Slattery's book, Xenolinguistics, Psychedelics, Language, and the Evolution of Consciousness, which could not be more relevant to today's conversation. That recording, as well as the recording of the first book club on Blind Sight by Peter Watts, another encounter with the truly other. Both of those are up on Patreon for anyone at any level. And I am finally ready to release a series of Patreon exclusive secret episodes of this show I've been keeping down in the wine cellar for some time now. I've recently found the time to edit those, so you'll be seeing those too if you're a supporter of this show. Also, thanks to everyone who has been rating and or reviewing this show wherever you listen to podcasts. The more ratings, the more reviews we can get up on iTunes, the more alluring an opportunity it is for high-profile guests to join these conversations, the easier it is to continue growing the audience of this show and the fabulous conversations that we have in our Facebook group. So it's not just some sort of empty social media metric, 500 likes, but it really does help me continue to grow this audience and to bring new, interesting people into the discussion. Then pop on over to iTunes, click subscribe, click 5 stars. You've done me and yourself a service, I believe. Now that I'm done saying that, I'm going to go rinse my mouth out and pray for your forgiveness. And while I'm doing that, enjoy this fabulous conversation with Sean Esbjörn-Hargens of Exostudies.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Sean, it is a pleasure to have you back on Future Fossils.
Yeah, it's good to be back, Michael, as always.
Yeah, so let's see. A year ago, we were talking about your business consultation work and your efforts to apply a sort of meta approach to value assessments and look at the way that bringing new perspectives to how we understand different types of capital or different types of wealth are going to transform the way that we practice business and are living with one another. But today we get to take it into what at first I think seems like the complete opposite total freak show direction and talk about your long-standing and now fruiting interest in the extraterrestrial lore.
Yeah.
So I'd love to start by just inviting you to explain why it took you so long to admit to the world that you are as interested in unidentified aerial phenomena and ostensible alien encounters as you are.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's as if our first show, as you mentioned, which was focusing on the meta-impact framework and the 10 types of capital that we use at Meta Integral to explore value accounting. That show is basically about my day job. And, and this show is about kind of the music I play at night and, smoke-filled bars and, exploring kind of the fringe of human experience and possibilities. Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. Why did it take me so long? And I think it speaks to one of the core aspects of this phenomenon. And by that, I mean, not just the UFO ET hypothesis, but kind of all paranormal realities. Because when you really start going into the UFO field, at least with an open heart and mind, you come across some really crazy shit. And, incredible people saying totally crazy, extraordinary things. And at least for me, as I've been roaming the range of literature in this field, like, it is a freak show. Like there are so many bizarre claims being made by, stand-up citizens and who are quite believable in what they're saying, even though what they're saying just does not map on to our general view of reality. Even for me as an integralist, even for me who's, way into transpersonal psychology and, extraordinary states of consciousness, right? So I'm pretty far out there for most people. And this stuff is even farther out, right? And so I've kind of landed on this phrase that I enjoy, which is, the truth is stranger than science fiction, right? It's not just stranger than fiction, it's stranger than science fiction, which, if you think about that, it's a pretty incredible claim. And so there's this huge taboo, right? Socially, professionally, around this topic, because it bumps up against it's a direct confrontation to our materialist paradigm and general consensus reality. And there's a lot of ways in which that view is policed by academic institutions, by professional establishments, and arguably maybe for some good reasons, but I think we're at a point where we need to kind of reconsider that and push back a little bit. So it took me a while just because I needed to really cook in the juices. And basically what happened, why I came out, right, of the UFO ET geek closet was I just was going so deep into this material that it activated what I call a soul impulse. And the impulse is just basically the sense of like, I got to say something because otherwise I'm out of integrity. Like there's something so important here. This taps into so many essential philosophical and scientific and psychological and sociological issues that I am violating a contract with myself at a deep level if I don't risk it and come out and at least say a few things. So here we are. This is my second live show. And let me pause there just to get your engagement.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes up for me is I've been reading Xenolinguistics, Diana Slattery's.
That book is amazing.
Yeah. And there is that section where she talks about how she conducted all of her psychonautic research alone and secretly, and that it was a real challenge for her to come out of the psychedelic closet and admit that she had been, channeling these scripts from the other, for the last decade, and that it had deeply informed her PhD thesis. But she says, Lorenzo Haggerty, host of Psychedelic Salon, says, the closet is full. It's like, there's too many people in there already. And there is something, I think your willingness to, I really don't know at this point in your career, now that you've sort of stepped out of the academic sphere, just how much is really on the line for you.
Yeah.
In terms of this decision. I think that you're in a much better position to speak to an area of broad cultural resonance. But there is that sense in which really any kind of challenge to the dominant paradigm requires people willing to make that risk. So I commend you. The other part of it though is that in discussing these things, and I'll link in the show notes to the interview that you did with Jeff Salzman for Daily Evolver, where you go over sort of the broad brushstrokes of an argument for why this is a necessary conversation. Not so much why this is an objective fact and why there's this Sean's interpretation and this is what's going on, but you just touch the bullet points of all of the people whose prestige has been accredited by the system that we believe, whose authority we place our lives in the hands of every day. Military generals, nuclear technicians, these, Harvard physicists like Avi Loeb, people that society says to trust these people. And yet there is this issue with not being willing to follow their authority all the way to where it actually leads us. And then on top of that, because this is a common issue we discuss on the show, there's no real way, you are such an exemplary scholar and you've spent, decades researching this, read hundreds of books. There's no way to compress the understanding that you come to. There's no way for you to convince anyone of anything, given the time that, the time of a conversation. So I don't know, that's just sort of two sort of challenges to having this conversation in the first place.
Yeah. And, I suspect there is a lot on the line for me. I run, an arguably mainstream progressive business consultancy. And I suspect at some point a client is going to come across, some of these conversations. And I imagine I'm going to have more. And so there's going to be a body material that builds up over the years. And, it'll be interesting just to see how that plays out, so there is a sense of risk, but like you pointed out, I'm no longer, a professor at a university and so there's not some of those types of, kind of knowledge policing dynamics that might be at play the way a lot of other people experience that. John Mack being the obvious poster boy for that dynamic at Harvard, when he came out with his research on, abductees and, and was pretty even-handed and, wasn't taking a strong stance on aliens per se as much as he was saying something powerful is going on here and we need to be open to it and we need to take seriously the things that these people are saying. And they're not, delusional. They're not psychiatric. They're not, falling into those categories. And yet he got pummeled, So I think that the visibility of that episode has made a lot of people such as me who start kind of, wading into these waters and kind of looking around for signals of like, am I okay? Is this going to be all right? And we see those kinds of examples and it makes us think twice. But as you pointed out, the closet's full. And one of the things that's really encouraged me, I had this soul impulse, which was just like, Sean, open your mouth, say something. So I started doing that. And every time I've done that, and I'm visible primarily in the integral community, as you know, though I run in a few other circles. But, in the integral community, I've been met with a lot of individuals just really thanking me and telling me their own experiences and basically coming out of the closet to me, not publicly. But there's been so many of them, and many of them are very visible individuals in our integral community, many of whom you would know. And yet they're not on the public record on this topic, and yet they're confiding in me because I've stuck my neck out. And that highlights for me that this is a topic that needs to be discussed, because there are too many people who are having kind of like, Diane was in xenolinguistics, are doing their little thing kind of off on the side, and it's really changing how they relate to each other, other people in the world, and, how they make sense of, the nature of reality. And yet, they feel the taboo. And I think the taboo itself is one of the interesting things. And I mentioned this in the conversation with Jeff. Like, to me, that in itself is like one reason why we should be talking about it, just because it's so simply taboo. Like, that's a good enough reason as anything. But I think the real issues are the ontological issues. And I'm willing to make some strong ontological claims. And I think the evidence supports it and backs it up. And I think if we're not willing to put our stake in the ontological ground, then, go somewhere else, right? Because we need to challenge not just the epistemological, perspectives. Everyone's right. Everyone's got a good viewpoint, and we got to find a way to kind of bring it all together. Amen to that. But let's really talk about the nature of reality. Let's talk about different layers and dimensions and different types of intelligences, and let's have a more provocative, threatening, challenging, sexy conversation about these topics.
All right, well, let's do that then, because yeah, I mean, I don't want to retreat into a conversation about a conversation here. I really, I think that something must emerge from the kind of study and contemplation that you've given this, to correlating all of the expert testimonies that have come out of top secret programs, that the kind of people that have put their own lives on the line in discussing this stuff. And then also, comparing that to, first of all, the insane and well-documented flood of misinformation, as well as just muddy thinking about this stuff. And on top of that, what, people like Jung and McKenna both have pointed to as the stubborn refusal of these phenomena to subject themselves to any kind of final answer, to sort of give us an easy explanation. So where are you on this? And if you can sort of compress it, I think it's also worth noting that, I never know who's listening, and, lots of long-term people and maybe some new people. So just to clarify, the integral community, where you are sort of regarded as one of the premier scholars and practitioners of that philosophical scene, is committed to a multiple perspective view of things, and regarding perspectives as more fundamental to reality than mind or matter, which are sort of like concepts that we extract from our experience. So there is a kind of tenacious stance on synthesizing multiple different methodologies, which I think already sets this conversation apart from a cut and dry kind of, we're going to use rigorous quantitative methods, trying to study these things merely empirically, merely with sort of the traditional modern scientific toolkit. So take it away, please.
Great. So let me just back up a little bit as kind of, and point out that part of what allowed me to come out and why the soul impulse kind of emerged so strongly was, after a decade of, basically reading 300 books and watching thousands of hours of video and audio, I got to the point where I felt comfortable that the evidence is robust, and it's robust from many perspectives, many angles, many types of knowledge traditions, whether it's anthropology or psychology or hard physics. So there was just a way in which the evidence just kept piling. And I just kept thinking, my God, how can there be this much evidence and yet it be such a silent conversation? And part of it, as you pointed out, is like there's a lot of stuff out there that's muddled thinking. There's a lot of misinformation, right? And so it makes it harder to see and identify like what is the evidence and how do we even define evidence, right? Because that's part of what gets raised in this. It's like what counts? Because there is really good photographic evidence, and yet a single photograph is not and hasn't, or even a group of really good verified, photographs are not changing the conversation. So it actually takes more than that. It takes a paradigm shift, right? And that's a long, slow process that usually involves a sequence of deaths, right? As the famous phrase goes. So there was something about all that reading, all that kind of individual research where I just thought, holy smokes, like this is a respectable conversation to be trying to champion, even if it's generally not viewed as such. The other thing is, in my integral phase, where I was really, kind of leading academic charge, as you might, recall, like I was, some of my latest work in that space was around, climate change and looking at climate change from multiple perspectives and, what I call integral epistemological pluralism and also integral methodological pluralism, right? So we need to look at a lot of different perspectives on the topic, and we also need to take into account all the different methods that can be used by scientists and the humanities and the social scientists and even artists, and right? So like, what's our pluralistic view of methodologies that allows us to get a better view of climate change as a complex phenomenon? Well, then the natural implication of working in that led me to what I call integral ontological pluralism. And, and this is where, Ken and I kind of started to bump into each other around, philosophically around this issue. Because I was highlighting that, well, you can't have epistemological pluralism and methodological pluralism without an accompanying ontological pluralism. So what does that really mean to live in a pluralist ontology, right? Basically, I think one way to think of it is like we live in a very complex, place with different social ontologies overlapping and, not just mentally living in different worldviews, but I think that even translates to actually ontologically in some important way. We live in different realities. And then when you start bringing in the paranormal, and the UFOs, the ETs, and you get into multidimensionality, then and even following like the latest stuff in physics, right? Then the whole idea of integral ontological pluralism starts to look cachet and appropriate. So you asked about like how do I make sense of all this? I think one of the best books that I've read in the last year or so is Jeff Kripal's book, The Supernatural, that he teams up with Whitney Strieber, the famous author in the 80s from Communion, which kind of launched the whole kind of abduction era. And in this book, he basically makes the case, and I think in a sufficient way, that the phenomenon is subjective and objective. It's subjective and objective simultaneously, and it's neither, right? And so I think what it's asking us is to re-examine our understanding of the relationship between mind and matter, and how do we relate to subject and object, and how has our current scientific methodologies failed us horribly in having a more sophisticated answer or framing or understanding of how these two aspects are related. And of course, integral theory uses the four quadrants to show that they're two sides of the same coin in a sense. I mean, that's a good start. But I think the more you go into the phenomenon, it is so bizarrely objective and subjective and both and neither that I think that's what's led it to often be dismissed by so many researchers, right? They just can't get their hands around it. But for me, it's exciting because my doctorate is essentially in philosophy. So to me, this is like one of the core issues at the heart of like, who are we? Why are we here? What are we doing? Right? And one of the main impulses behind integral theory, is how do we reconceptualize? How do we re-methodologize? How do we re-ontologize the relationship between the subject and the object? And one of the things that are presented in integral theory often looks at panpsychism, where mind goes all the way down and matter and mind arise together and always there simultaneously. And more complex matter allows for more complex mind and so forth. Right? So that's one powerful view. Another one is the dual aspect monism. And Kripal talked about this in his new book, The Flip, right? And he points to this, school of thought, which basically says that, mind and matter are actually kind of an expression of a deeper fundamental oneness, and that the panpsychists folks, they drive consciousness all the way down, but then they still kind of have this problem right when you get down to the very bottom of like, how do these two things connect? Like, what's the Lego block that allows them to touch each other, right? And so, regardless of whether we take a dual aspect monist view or panpsychist view or any number of the other kind of interesting contending views, I think we need to reimagine and consider the relationship between the inside and the outside, because these phenomena are showing us over and over again that we are misunderstanding that relationship.
Okay, so in all your talk of this, my brain tends to run down the same gutter all the time,
right,
hearing about this kind of stuff, which is this notion that these boundary transitions, like major evolutionary transitions like the origins of life or the origins of multicellularity or the origins of human society, are ways for system, and again, I'm describing this entirely in the language of like functional relationships of the parts of a system, which is just one of these many things, but working here at Santa Fe Institute has me kind of embedded in the lingo. So take, for example, the emergence of human language, speaking in sentences. Martin Nowak and Natalia Komarova and David Krakauer and all these people were working on this notion that syntactic communication emerged as a way of maintaining a high signal to noise ratio in communication, because the more circumstances, the more situations we were trying to communicate to one another, the more our language fell short and the more we had to come up with new words. And then the more that the number of words that we had to remember, the relevant vocabulary within a human tribe became so great that individual people couldn't remember all the necessary words. And so speaking in sentences emerged as a strategy, like a recombinant strategy, where we could use less memory to communicate more, and that would drop the error rate down. So that this whole notion that these crises between one paradigm and another paradigm represent a crisis of basically noise and error, and that there's something in that I hear when we talk about the insufficiency of our language and of our tools to communicate the complexity of these phenomena, this like tetratic logic instead of a binary logic, and a new syntax, a syntax beyond the subject verb object syntax that we use. So it almost challenges the whole like integral epistemological, methodological, ontological framing of things. Right. Like even that kind of sophistication seems to like stumble on this, because we're still sort of bound to a subject object binary. And so my question, I guess, is just like, how do you imagine or like, do you think it's even sort of possible for any one of us to imagine how a new syntax might erupt out of this space that makes sense of these things? And like, what kind of knowledge production occurs in those new spaces? Yeah, no, it's great. And I think in hearing you speak to kind of the language issue as just an illustration of a larger point you're making, I really am drawn to the notion of expressive capacity. And, and I got this from Arthur Brock, who works with, Holochain and, some of the work he's done in that space to kind of basically try and come up with a new syntax that gets out of the binary of, how we've tended to kind of code, based on certain categories of dividing information. He's tried to take a more organic kind of metaphor to support the work he's doing there. And I use the notion of expressive capacity a lot in the meta-impact work. So to have integration, what occurs prior to integration is differentiation. And so you can't integrate unless you differentiate. And the more you differentiate, the more you can integrate. It's almost counterintuitive. We often, as integralists, often get focused on the integration and the wholeness and don't fully appreciate that actually what comes before that is partness. And the more partness we have, the better, in the sense that it enables a richer integration of those parts across each other to get a more multidimensional integration opposed to a simple integration. And so with language, I think
we really are lacking the expressive capacity to talk about these phenomena. And we do get pulled in through our own enculturation, our own biology into the subject-object paradigm. And so I don't think it's going to be easy to overcome that. But I think when you look at some of the more extreme experiences people have, one of the things that's constant, that's just like kind of what's always there in this literature is telepathy, right? And so that's an even interesting consideration that these non-human intelligences are always generally, like 90+% of the time communicating to us telepathically. So they're not even, using language in the vocal cord sense, that like they're giving us information, and somehow that information gets translated into English or German or Japanese or whatever our mother tongue is, and we understand it, right? So that's curious. Like, how does that even fit with, like the theory of language evolution that you were presenting, which I think is probably true, right? I think there's a lot to be said about like that was the strategy of differentiation of language into sound and words and linguistic systems, right? But is that the only avenue for thinking? And when you look at animal consciousness, which is one of my specialties, right, then animals generally appears to think in pictures, right? And so a lot of telepathic experiences with animals is more picture based, and then you also get these stories, and a lot of them people getting downloads from different types of intelligences or different sources, where a ton of information is packed into basically like kind of a crystalline form, so it's like quantum computing. So it's like, what's the world look like when we really transition to quantum computing, where we're no longer bound by the binary, but we are living in a multidimensional series of potential, wave and particle constructs that are occurring simultaneously. We're not having to choose particle or wave, right? That we can allow for a multiplicity of any number of scenarios that increases our computing power and, and our epistemological power, ontological power, our methodological power, right? So I think, and this is why I like Kripal's work so much, is because I think he's really struggling on this edge. Like, what is the language that we need to be fumbling into to try and talk about the way in which this phenomenon doesn't fit in the typical subject-object categories, because it's both, it's combined, and it's neither. So what does that really mean? Right. And so, when you look at the research they did in the, Hunt Skinwalker Ranch, right, where, Bigelow coming in with, millions of dollars funding.
Talk a little bit more about that particular historical event, I think, is just to frame it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's a great book out on it with George Knapp, and, it's one of the co-authors. And recently, Jeremy Corbell also did a documentary on it. There's essentially what would most likely be called by most people a portal in Utah, in a particular area on this ranch. And there's a long history of strange phenomenon occurring on that ranch because the portal's right there. And the phenomena have ranged from poltergeist activity, ghosts, cryptoids, so seeing big cats, Bigfoots, other creatures that shouldn't exist, UFOs, strange evil presences, giant wolves, just like the range of phenomena is just like kind of cuts across all the categories of bizarre. And so Bigelow bought this property 20 plus years ago, and basically brought in a team of PhD researchers with great credentials, and they spent several years with all the scientific equipment they could get their hands on, with all the money they needed to conduct the experiments and to really try and capture this phenomenon. And most of them had very strange experiences, not all of them, which also raises interesting issues like why some, not others. And one of the things that kept happening is like some strange phenomena would happen over in one field on one night, and it wouldn't ever happen again there. And then something totally different and bizarre would happen in the trees over on the ridge on the other side, right? So there was no shortage of bizarre paranormal events that span the whole range of documented weirdness, but it never was repeatable. So the scientific method was never really able to be used, even though they got a lot of data. In a sense, they got a lot of stories and anecdotes, and people kept having weird experiences, and and they're reputable scientists, so clearly something beyond our normal sense of real is happening there. And yet it was as if the phenomenon itself, and this is what a lot of people report, the phenomenon itself has some quality of intelligence that it's playing games with us, that there's this trickster element where it's like, and it knows what we're doing. It's 2 steps ahead of us. It's dangling some bait in front of us and pulling us over here and then looping around behind us and scaring the shit out of us, right? So there's some bizarre trickster intelligence that occurs with a lot of this phenomenon that suggests some weird meta realm of something, right?
This is very much in keeping with, science fiction writer John C. Wright's his story of his personal conversion from atheism to being a born-again Catholic in midlife, where he said, it's interesting because I've read his books both before and after this event took place for him. But, he mentioned how he was committed to his rational atheism, and as a rational person decided that he had to take seriously the theological argument that a transcendental intelligence chooses whether it appears to you or not.
Right.
That, that there is a sense that, like, how could we possibly be expected to catch something that's smarter than we are?
Yeah.
Or to detect something whose cognitive processes are so more complex than us, than it's like a cell inferring that you're part of a lawyer.
Right.
Like, give me a break. So he issued a challenge to God, like a legit atheist would do, and says, if you are, I accept that this is logically consistent. So if you do exist, show yourself to me. And then 2 days later, he had a heart attack that put him in the hospital, and he said he had 3 spirit visitations while in the hospital. Very Dickensian. And that by the end of it, he was convinced that he became a Catholic and accepted, and then wrote this fabulous, although very bizarre, space opera, the Eschaton sequence. It's like 1,000 pages of science fiction, kind of expanding the Olaf Stapledon cosmology into this more detailed view, where he talks about layers of ecological succession as different races come into maturity in the cosmos, and then generate new ecosystems and new worlds of life within themselves. And that his sort of almost sort of like a Mahayana Buddhist stance after that, and that he started working out in his narratives, which again, to shout out Avi Loeb, who was had a you mentioned other people in the integral community who have been forthright about their alien experiences. Stuart Davis is one of those people who was on Weird Studies. Highly recommend that episode of Weird Studies podcast to anybody who wants a truly compelling and bizarre story in which you have multiple witnesses of these kinds of events. Right. And I remember years ago, Stuart interviewed Avi about his argument that due to if we're to accept Big Bang theory, then the conditions of the early cosmos would have been actually, in some respects, more conducive to life. That the temperature that would support biochemical processes was more evenly distributed throughout the universe, and so Avi's got this kind of provocative stance that we may actually be late to the table, and that we may be like living in a world that's just positively suffused with intelligences billions of years more sophisticated than our own. Anyway, that may all be a tangent, because I'm that is sort of in some sense my left brain attempt to render this in terms I can understand.
The point you're making earlier, that I think there is this participatory dimension, right? And then that also doesn't totally fit into the subject-object binary, because there's a way in which, as people start to have, one-siding, they start to have more, and and even though some people who go out and want to have these experiences don't, but, so it's not like you get to choose whether or not you participate, but there is a participatory dimension. And that's a very fascinating aspect of, that this phenomena is responsive and engaged, right? And it's, and it was actually in reading The Hunt for Skinwalker, Ranch, there's a quote towards the end where basically it's saying, the Bigfoot people hate this because they don't want any paranormal activity because they're trying to prove this is a biological animal that just hasn't been discovered. The ghost hunter hate because they don't want anything to do with the UFO people because that's going to make them seem even crazier. The UFO nuts and bolts people don't want anything to do with this because they're looking for trace materials on the ground from the landings, The paranormal UFO people don't want anything to do, and basically this quote goes through this list of like all these different paranormal camps who are, hating each other because they're trying to like protect their little space of paranormal, and they're afraid through association with these other crazies, they're going to be delegitimized. And as I read that quote, I thought, oh my gosh, we need a meta view. We need an integral view. We need to step back, because at the end of the day, while I believe there are UFOs and I believe there are intelligences, inhabiting those craft, if we want to call them craft, they're not all craft. But so that's one part of it, but that's not even the most interesting part. The interesting part is it's actually weirder and more bizarre and more multidimensional than even that, right? Like, so like, accept UFOs, accept ETs, and like that's just the beginning, because it only spirals out from there, right? And so like this is why I launched the Institute of Exostudies, because I wanted to back up from UFO and ET hypothesis, because I don't want to get pulled into that, because I think that's just one piece of the crazy pie, right? And so how do we get enough meta distance to really talk about living in a multidimensional multiverse with all the potential implications of that?
Yeah, and just to add one tiny annotation to this, it seems as though science is, in some respects, the sort of fundamental assumptions or the strategies of science would actually support this. I haven't gotten anybody at SFI to agree with me on this particular point, but it does seem to me that if we are seeking an explanation, if we're seeking a model of the cosmos that is as simple as parsimonious as possible, if we're looking for the lowest algorithmic complexity of the equation of our universe, it's not going to be an equation like the kind we're looking for, where we're trying to answer why this and not everything else.
Right.
It's just going to be an equation that says this. And likewise, Richard Doyle, I've been in correspondence with him, and I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he, Penn State professor who's done a lot of exploration into the n-dimensional identity that is disclosed by the psychedelic experience, and how that sort of prepares us, he believes, for a condition of transhumanism in which we've moved beyond the sort of naive simplicity of the subject-object distinction.
Yeah.
He was referencing, I cannot recall last night, some philosopher who he felt had made a really compelling argument that we can say sort of consciousness is, in formal mathematical terms, and factor out any kind of content or object or subject.
Right.
And simply, it's the remainder when we make everything as simple as possible. Right. Which, to loop that back into people like Philip K. Dick, one of Richard Doyle's favorite authors and topics of conversation, then, I remember in high school reading the collected essays of Phil Dick and encountering for the first time this notion that came up again in this book that I was reading in class with your wife so many years ago, On Becoming Aware, which, makes a similar argument that we can't say in any concrete terms that people are crazy.
Right.
We can only say whether or not their reported subjective experience correlates with other experiences.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, there's something in the sort of ontological pluralism. We're walking a tightrope now over the sort of ravine of letting everyone believe whatever the hell they want. But I don't know, what is all of this insight for you?
Yeah. Well, and this was one of the bodies of evidence that really kind of supported me with kind of coming out, and that is our mainstream and progressive scientific theories are totally capable of supporting this, right? So it's like everything that we've talked about today is not outside what's explainable in the current scientific approaches in many cases, right? When we look at the new physics, we look at quantum theory, we look at even the research with psi, and so there's our progressive views of physics and complexity science are so far ahead of the conversation that they're actually much more capable of holding some of this multidimensionality than we might realize. So it's not even that the multidimensionality is unexplainable with current theories. It in many cases is, right? So that's one piece. The other piece is, I think we're in a post-truth world, in part thanks to President Trump. And so what does that mean? And it's almost as if the pluralism of the academy has been unleashed onto the mainstream, right? So the aperspectival madness of postmodernism that was rampant in, the university setting is now in the mainstream political cultural setting. And it's a very disorienting space. And this is part of one of the challenges we're facing moving forward, is that, we can no longer tell the truth from the non-truth, right? It's like there are really good legitimate photographs and trace evidence and all kinds of physical evidence for UFO craft and other kind of otherworldly realities. And yet there are so many fakes and so many, it's like, so how do we sort through that? You almost can't. And, people, I was reading a book called American Cosmic. And this woman is a religious studies professor, and she's looking at the techies in Silicon Valley and how a lot of them are, exploring kind of otherworldly intelligences and technologies and bringing that into the work they're doing in Silicon Valley. So she's talking to a guy who's an expert in photo analysis, and he creates a group where they go out and they take pictures of UFOs or UAPs, and you're only allowed to be in the group like if you really have good credentials and you're not involved with faking or hoaxing, and that you're really committed to really capturing this on film. But he points out that it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish the fakes from the real ones. That, 5 years ago he could do that, but now the computer technology, CGI, is such that it's harder and harder, and some cases can't even tell. So we're entering into an augmented and virtual space. And we're seeing this with our technology, and we're seeing it in our politics, and I think it's happening on a big scale. So I think we are going into a space that's going to be ontologically fragmented, right? And highly pluralistic and solipsistic. And so how do we navigate that culturally? I don't know, but I think we're largely unprepared for the amount of fragmentation that's going to come with that. Even a broad empiricism, I don't think protects us or gets us through this process. So I'm not sure. I think it's going to be challenging because, we're going to go from everyone's epistemological view goes to everyone's ontological reality goes, right? And then we're really unanchored. And I think there'll be a flourishing that comes with that. I think there'll be a lot of benefits. And I think it's also going to be very problematic and chaotic.
Yeah, in some sense, if the world space is like the, semantic unit of some noospheric internal chatter, again to this sort of notion that the proliferation of noisy and discongruous realities seems to suggest that we're on the threshold of some new order.
Yeah.
And again, Terence McKenna talked about this. He talked about the UFO appearing in history at the moment that we're. You mentioned this in the Salzman interview, and this is a common strain in UFO discourse, that there's a significant uptick in UFO sightings and conversation around the time of the dropping of the first atom bombs. And, a lot of people have looked at that in terms of, maybe it's some sort of cosmic nanny state, making sure we don't blow ourselves up or harm the aura of the planet. But then there's this other sense in which you listen to people like William Irwin Thompson talk about that phase in history, and Bill Thompson, who is not afraid of pushing the mystic frontiers of polite conversation. He sees it as that this is the moment that we realized that we were all downwind of one another's fallout. Yeah. And it was sort of the moment that we became aware of ourselves as, each nation, and by extension, each citizen of each nation, as focal points of a single planetary system. Stuart Brand's getting that blue marble photograph declassified, and how that was the prime image of the 20th century. And then Terence McKenna says, well, so the UFO shows up now, not necessarily because of any kind of existential risk to humankind that it's trying to avert, although we do have so many compelling, weird testimonies from people working these nuclear bases, the missiles going dud and that kind of thing. So maybe we should circle back around to that. But that we're just at a point now where we have, like a child entering puberty, we have learned that there is an other. It's like the UFO is like humankind discovering girls or boys.
Right.
That there's this sense in which with the horizon of the other has moved beyond the tribe living over the next hill, and past the nation living across the ocean, and into this like complex manifold of like polysocial realities, and even past that into a question of what are we even looking for, because we have now all of our theories about life and intelligence and mind are limited to the n=1 sample of this planet. And so there is this projection into that space. So I don't know. I feel like there's kind of two things there. One is the way that this is sort of an invitation into a consideration of the other and what that means in a planetary culture. And then the other is really what the hell is going on with these nuclear bases and like the sort of exo-interventionism that we seem to be observing, which also sort of manifests in terms of like abductions and cattle mutilations and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So a few things that weave some of that together. So one, so going back to the post-truth era we're in, I think it's forcing a re-engagement with ontology, because we're asking ourselves, how can we anchor truth claims, right? Like, wow, this is craziness, like how? So we're having to kind of come up with new methodologies, new kinds of discrimination, new ways of vetting, new ways of trying to figure out, truth from post-truth, and what does that even mean, right? And, like if we just look at gender, right? What's happening with gender? Like it is just exploding, right? And, there's so many different sexual orientations now, like I can't even keep track. Like seriously, it's like there's over 10. And just like the gender binary is totally out the door now, right? It's on passports. We're changing, the census data. Like, it'll take some time, but it's like, so we're no longer like, that's one example of a place where we're finding our language to break free of that binary, right? Of boy and girl. And so we're also seeing, like in anthropology, there's an ontological turn. Right. And we're also seeing in philosophy, there's an ontological turn. So in a lot of traditions that have been extremely kind of bathed in postmodern discourse are grabbing for ontology and trying to figure out how to reweave ontology into what they're doing. So I think as we get to this, kind of extreme post-truth phase, we're also engaging in a deeper consideration of ontology, right? I don't think the post-truth stuff's going to go away. I think it's going to stay in many ways. But I think there's going to be a new engagement with ontology. And there's even like new materialisms, right? There's new kinds of thinking about what does ontology even mean, right? And especially when we get into the subtle realms, right? And not just the gross realm and the physical realm, right? And we get in, where imagination has a causal power that isn't available in the gross realm. Right. And so how do we make sense of kind of the ontology of these different kind of domains or spheres? And so we're going to have to develop a more sophisticated discourse around what's real. And Kripal calls this the new real, right? That we're embarking in the process of kind of discovering the new real, right? That's kind of beyond the subject-object binary, where the new real is some version of, yes, in some cases they're subject-object, some cases they're together, in some cases it's neither, right? And I think this is so going into the other, I think this is one of the things that makes this whole topic so scary for us. I mean, we look at how tribal we are. We don't do well just with competing political platforms, right? And the racism and the sexism, the homophobia, and so on and so on. Like, I mean, our world is just replete with all kinds of othering, right? And so if you introduce the alien other, whatever that means, right, then like, wow, and so a lot of the literature basically says that they're not going to present themselves in any demonstrative way until we get past that point, right? That remains to be seen. Like, I think there's some ways in which it's already, the crack is there and the light's getting through, and maybe coming into deeper open contact with some of the other types of intelligences might support us in some ways to kind of get past some of our tribalism, though there will be certain factors where it will reinforce the tribalism. So, it's going to be an interesting process. But I think humans are part of a larger galactic humanity. So what does that mean? Like, and how do we understand that, right? It's only a matter of time, and I mean like 10 years, before we confirm that there's biomicro life on one of the other, orbs in our solar system, right? Be it, Mars or one of the, moons around Saturn or, so we're not that far from discovering, some form of mini life elsewhere. And as soon as that happens, then the floodgates are going to start to open around the implications of that, right? And, and the statistics of how many, Earth-like planets that are out there, are so mind-blowing that, like, how can we assume that there aren't other types of intelligences? But I think this issue of the other is a really powerful and potent one, and part of why it's so shadowy, right? Because we're really going to be confronted with some deep biases and assumptions about who we are when we enter into some kind of more open conversation around the likelihood and the evidence that there's not just a few different species out there, but there's actually hundreds, right? And one of the things that comes through in the literature and in the testimonies is that most of them are bipedal like us, and that there's some sacred geometry around the pentagram of the 5. There's something about that structure that shows up over and over again with a wide range of non-human intelligences, even though there's other shapes and forms out there, but that's a kind of a cosmic template that we come across over and over again. And so in that sense, humanity is much larger than our particular embodied expression of it.
That's interesting. There was a conference here on evolution at SFI a few months ago where we were talking about developmental bias. And what this means is that, given the range of all possible forms produced by evolution, why do we see so few of them? And they've tackled this very rigorously over here. There are scaling laws involved, et cetera. But a lot of it has to come down to this like paleontologist Simon Conway Morris argument about strong convergence. And
Right.
and it's been interesting that, that the notion that under similar physical constraints, life finds similar solutions again and again and again independently. Noted biologist E.O. Wilson, like one of the most respected evolutionary thinkers in the world, came out and said that he thinks the sort of Star Trek anthropoid human convergent, that if we're going to encounter the intelligent aliens out there, that they probably will look something a lot like us because of similar tool use requirements, similar social communication requirements. Having a free pair of limbs with some grabbers on it, is really helpful. Having an expressive face of some kind that can be sensed by other members of your community.
Yeah.
And so it starts seeming, we're sort of grading into the plausible here. But I want to dogleg, since you brought up Kripal, and Kripal spoke so favorably about the work of Eric Wargo in his book Time Loops.
Yeah, that book is amazing.
Yeah, so Kripal calling time loops the sort of most heroic or whatever, virtuosic work of paranormal coverage since Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, which is really sort of a definitive text in the exo conversation.
Yeah, and I bought the book after I read Kripal's endorsement. I was like, oh my God.
yeah. So I'm working to get Eric on the show. It's going to happen here soon. But Eric's got an interesting point that sort of dovetails into this question about the human extraterrestrial, which is that so many of these disclosure reports from people suggest that at least some of these beings are future humans. And Eric Wargo's book talks a lot about that there may be a simple way to explain so much of this telepathic and other forms of paranormal phenomena if we consider the possibility, as Jacques Vallée actually also gave a TEDx talk on this, that there may be some sort of backwash, that that time is not, that even here at SFI in the research theme on complex time, they're talking about arrows of time, and that there being an arrow of time that's about entropy and an adaptive arrow of time that's about the emergence of order, and that any system you look at is some unfathomably complex manifold of different temporal vectors. So I guess I'm just sort of inviting you to talk about what you make of the conversation around the extraterrestrial humanoid as some sort of intimation of a possible or actual future of human evolution.
I think that is absolutely one layer of what's happening, right? that, some of the beings that are being encountered are future versions of what we would consider ourselves. I was at South by Southwest 2 years ago and listening to a NASA scientist, and they were describing how if we lived on Mars, for, X number of generations, that basically we would start to get skinnier, we would get taller, our heads would get bigger, right? They basically started describing what a gray looks like, right? That a lot of the features we associate with kind of the classical alien are some of the natural ways in which our own morphology would shift under different gravity conditions, right? And so, I found that very provocative and interesting, that is the future us. Like, as we follow Elon to Mars and create a base on the moon and then a colony on Mars in the next 50 years, that as people are born on Mars, grow up on Mars, have children on Mars, that we are going to become a different species genetically because of the way we interface with the environmental conditions there, and that those versions of ourselves are going to start to look much more like what we think of as aliens. So I thought that was fascinating kind of trajectory of time. So yeah, and this is the whole thing with Exostudies. Like, yes, some of them are future versions of ourselves, right, coming back for different reasons, and then some of them aren't, right? And this is the thing, it's like so many kind of UFO ET enthusiasts often want to kind of put everything in one box. Like, they're all bad, they're all good, they're all future versions of ourselves. I think it's much messier and chaotic than that, right? I think some of them are actual, different types of beings that come from the past. Like the mantis beings are often considered to be very ancient and live thousands of years, right? Stuart described, his powerful experience of that, right? And Stuart, by the way, was one of the reasons why I came out, because he and I were exchanging emails and comparing notes and kind of egging each other on. And it's like, okay, no, you go. No, you go. Okay, I'll do it. So he came out with his audio documentary before I did, but, we were kind of, supporting each other as fellow integralists. And then, like, getting back to the nukes, it's like, right, so is those future versions of ourselves coming back and trying to save us from planetary annihilation? Maybe. It seems it's a fair assumption. And, being part of a larger galactic family, like, it makes sense that, if we're detonating nuclear bombs, that people would notice, right? In other realms, other dimensions, like, that the thought is that kind of blast actually penetrates across multiple layers of reality. And so it's kind of like a signal for, like, oh boy, what's going on over there? Let's go check it out. And, and so the amount of evidence around nuclear bases and UFOs is immense, right? So clearly they have showed up to interface with that part of humanity. Though I think there's also good evidence that they've been coming for quite a long time, right? Though I think they started coming en masse once we developed nuclear capabilities.
So, you mentioned going over this with Stuart Davis, and I feel like it's important to interject here that Stuart furiously refuses any kind of attempt to make sense of his experiences. Yep. He is quite happy to not tell a story about this. Actually, rather unhappy, when Phil Ford and J.F. Martel encourage him to explain what he thinks is going on. And so there's clearly a sort of dispositional difference between the two of you and how you handle this. And I'm curious, that is his strategy, I think, for avoiding confirmation bias and just sort of allowing when it's so unfathomably difficult to try and figure out how you would study these things with the tools that we have, it is obviously very easy to allow quasi-religious narratives to flood into that gap. And I'm curious, since you are, leading a group of scholars through this in a course this year, what are the kinds of strategies that you would offer or encourage for people to remain with the weirdness of these phenomena without collapsing the sort of wave function before it's time?
Well, this is great. Yeah, and this is kind of my core orientation, right, with Exostudies, is that I don't want to collapse the wave function. I want to just say there's a lot of weird stuff happening. We're far from making sense of it. Like, I think there's a lot of layers to truth to the different interpretations, but none really reigns the day, and we really got to stay open to this. And, the position that Stewart's in is very common, and Kreibel points this out, for example, in his new book, The Flip, right, where people with a scientific orientation and background have an extreme experience of consciousness or a mystical event or a paranormal event, and they basically flip over to recognizing the truth of those realities, but they often are resistant to trying to label it or put too much, of a frame around it, similar to Stewart, where it's like he won't deny the impact and kind of the ontological nature of it, and John Mack talked about the ontological shock of these experiences with the abductees he worked with, right? Because it shocked you to your core in many cases, right? And so that's kind of like undeniable on a first person, cellular level. And that the experience is so paradoxical that you can't really put too many frames around it if you stay true to the experience. But a lot of people it's too much, and they will kind of reduce it down into this narrative or that narrative, and that's fine. For myself, I've had enough of my own experiences to feel the paradoxical nature of those phenomena. But I think in contrast to Stewart, though I think he's doing this in his own way, I'm feeling more a call of kind of like an ambassadorship, right? Of like trying to help create spaces where more of us can gather, hence the course in the fall, right? In September through December, to like have these conversations and keep it open. I think one of the core strategies you asked about is hermeneutic generosity, a sense of critical thinking, but from a place of generosity, right? Around where we just stay open, right? I think, postmodernism has been so jaded, the hermeneutics of suspicion and kind of, that I think when we approach these different phenomena, we need a very different orientation. So that would be one. Deep listening, right, would be another. Deep listening to other people's experiences and their narratives. I think an examination of your own unconscious commitments to materialism. And so as an integralist, as a transpersonalist, I thought I was way clear of this. Right? Until I started, having experiences and doing more reading and research in this area, and started realizing how deep my own materialistic, reductionistic tendencies go. In spite of my intellectual kind of critique and desire to be way beyond that. But what I realized is that I've been growing up in a culture that has been successful in encoding into me, in spite of myself, a certain orientation to a kind of scientific materialism. So I think kind of being on the lookout for how that shows up in ourselves, and not that that's all bad. I think that it helps serve as a counterpoint to, going off in certain directions. So I think there's a usefulness to it. But I think being aware of how we've been enculturated, regardless of what we might think in terms of our self-identity, is important. And just getting out of the disciplines, right? So part of what we do in the course is, right, we have 2 books each week. So it's 36 different books. But they're books from all kinds of different places. They're not just UFO books, right? They're books from philosophy of mind. They're books from media studies. They're books from, the latest in quantum thinking. They're books on religious studies. They're, and it's basically like kind of reaching out in a meta view of like, to really bring any kind of justice to this inquiry, we need to draw on the best thinking from as many different kinds of disciplines as we can, because the phenomenon is that big and that mysterious and that paradoxical. And so unless we're, anything short of kind of a meta integrative approach, and even that is going to fail.
Oh, it definitely will. So, this is the moment where I ask, if someone wants to throw their moth mind at this particular flame, where do they find out more information and sign up for your course?
Yeah, so exostudies.org. You see the course. It gives a nice overview. There's an update section, where I'll be posting this conversation along with others. And yeah, just reach out to me through the contact page there. And I've been really enjoying the emails I've been getting from folks. And as I mentioned, like, that's really encouraged me to kind of go forth, right? And to keep kind of putting myself out there. Because I just keep discovering how many people are having their own experiences of one sort or another and feeling very alone, or only able to talk about it with a select group of people, So it's been exciting for me to just see how many people are engaged in this, even though it's not as public as it would be nice for it to be.
Yeah, remember everybody, Rule 34, if it exists, there is porn of it. And there's a whole community. And then I guess Rule 35 would be, if you're not sure if it exists or not, there is and is not and both is and is not, and neither is and is not porn of it. Right. So
that's awesome.
Well, dude, it's always a treat to talk to you. I want to give you the same invitation I gave at the end of the last call, which is, I believe I did, I typically do, which is to imagine into the unborn future audience of this show. And and I don't know, what do you hope that they get out of this conversation, or like what question might you pose them in regards to all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I think it's like, how might we collectively engage in a more sophisticated conversation around these anomalous experiences, these reports, the wide range of evidence? How might we engage that in a way that helps us collectively explore and understand in a more meaningful way what it means to live in a multidimensional multiverse? So yeah, that's my sense of what I would like.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sean.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Michael. I look forward to the next conversation.
This show is supported by listeners like you through patreon.com/Michael Garfield. And this week's featured patron is Mike Schwab of knowyourmeme.com. Know Your Meme is a really curious harbinger of the kinds of academic intellectual conversations bound to erupt in the years to come around the artifacts and trace fossils left by our web goofery. It's a really cool resource where you can go look for the history and the detail about a given meme, like Grumpy Cat, rest in peace. Knowyourmeme.com. Check them out. Also, thanks to MindPod Network, the podcasting network of which Future Fossils is a part. Go to mindpodnetwork.com and check out all of the shows. They're all wonderful in their own unique way. And if you'd like to offer any feedback, you can email me voice memos or text to futurefossilspodcast@gmail.com. And if you do leave a voice memo, there's a very strong possibility I will play it on a future episode of this show. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.